If you asked a civilian in 1944 to describe General George S. Patton, they would likely use words like ruthless, profane, and bloodthirsty. The press called him old blood and guts. He was the man who slapped shopped soldiers in Sicily. He was the commander who drove his men through the freezing meat grinder of the Battle of the Bulge with a relentless, terrifying aggression. To the German high command, he was a mechanized monster. To his own men, he was a brilliant but terrifying taskmaster who demanded absolute perfection and zero hesitation. But this public persona was a carefully constructed mask. Beneath the polished helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, and the endless stream of profanity, George S. Patton was a deeply complex, highly emotional romantic. He was a man who believed in reincarnation, read ancient history in the original Latin, and wrote highly emotional poetry. He wept openly over the graves of his fallen men. He possessed a strict, ancient chivalric code that dictated how a warrior should behave. And nothing violated that chivalric code more than the suffering of the innocent. As the mighty Third Army smashed its way toward the borders of the Third Reich, a horrifying humanitarian crisis was unfolding on the roads of Europe. It was a crisis that forced the everyday American GI to suppress their own humanity just to survive the psychological trauma of war. But it was also a crisis that would eventually cause America's most fearsome general to physically halt his own unstoppable war machine. To understand the magnitude of what Patton did, you have to understand how an armored convoy of the U.S. Third Army operated. Patton's entire military philosophy was based on a single word: momentum. He believed that speed was the ultimate weapon. If you keep moving, the enemy cannot zero their artillery. If you keep moving, the enemy cannot dig in. An armored column on the move was a living, breathing beast of logistics involving thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks operating on a strict minute-by-minute timetable. Because of this, the standing orders for motorized columns were absolute. You do not stop, you do not block the road. If a vehicle breaks down, you push it into the ditch and keep driving. But as the Allies pushed into the winter of 1944 and 1945, the roads were no longer just filled with military traffic, they were choked with millions of displaced persons, or DPs. These were refugees fleeing the front lines, survivors of liberated slave labor camps, and families whose cities had been bombed into dust. They were starving, freezing, and dying of typhus in the gutters. For the American convoys driving through this apocalyptic landscape, the situation presented an impossible moral dilemma. The American GI was not inherently cruel. The boys from Ohio, Texas, and New York who drove the tanks and trucks were deeply traumatized by the suffering they saw. But in a war zone, compassion can be fatal. If a convoy stopped to hand out rations to starving refugees, thousands more would swarm the vehicles. The road would be blocked. The timetable would be destroyed. And a stationary convoy was a prime target for German artillery spotters or a strafing run by the Luftwaffe. Stopping meant risking the lives of your own men. Furthermore, there was a psychological limit to what a soldier could process. The GIs were already dealing with the fear of death, the loss of their friends, and the sheer exhaustion of combat. To let the suffering of every orphan child or freezing widow into their hearts would break their minds entirely. So, they developed a psychological armor. They learned to stare straight ahead. As the massive Sherman tanks and supply trucks roared through the ruined villages, the troops forced themselves to ignore the hands reaching out to them. They ignored the cries of the women. They ignored the starving children standing barefoot in the freezing mud. It was a cold, brutal, and utterly necessary defense mechanism. The troops believed that their commanders, especially a man as ruthless as Patton, expected them to be heartless machines of war. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The incident occurred as a massive element of the Third Army was pushing along a miserable, bombed-out road. likely during the brutal winter campaigns in the Lorraine or the Ardennes. The conditions were horrific, a freezing mixture of mud, sleet, and diesel exhaust. A heavy armored convoy was rumbling through the ruins of a town. On the side of the road, huddled in the freezing mud amidst the rubble, were several civilian children. They were in rags, shivering violently, and weeping from starvation and the deafening noise of the passing armor. Truck after truck, tank after tank rolled past them. The GIs, adhering to their unwritten rule of survival, stared straight ahead. The convoy did not slow down. Suddenly, a high-pitched siren pierced the roar of the diesel engines. It was Patton's command vehicle, a heavily modified Jeep with a massive horn, oversized 3-star placards, and a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the back. Patton's driver aggressively swerved around the creeping supply trucks, cutting off the lead elements of the column. Patton stood up in the Jeep and screamed for the entire convoy to halt. The screech of brakes echoed down the line. Tank commanders popped their hatches, terrified that they had driven into a German ambush. MPs rushed forward, expecting the general to be furious about a delay in the timetable. After all, this was the man who preached that stopping was a sin against the military. What the men witnessed next shattered every preconceived notion they had about old blood and guts. Patton didn't look at his maps. He didn't look at the officers running up to his Jeep. He leaped out of his vehicle and marched directly through the freezing mud toward the side of the road, straight toward the crying children. The imposing, terrifying general, a man who had ordered the destruction of entire cities, dropped to his knees in the filth. Witnesses on Patton's staff described the surreal, shocking scene. Patton's face, normally locked in a terrifying scowl, broke completely. He reached out and pulled the freezing, filthy children into his arms. He began to weep openly, the tears streaming down his face, completely unashamed of his emotion in front of thousands of his own hardened troops. He stripped off his own heavy uniform coat or blankets from his Jeep and wrapped them around the orphans. Then, the weeping grandfather vanished, and the terrifying warlord returned. Patton stood up, his face red with a mixture of tears and absolute, furious rage. He turned to the officers and the tank commanders who had been rolling past the children. His voice, famously high, pitched but capable of cutting through the noise of an entire army, boomed across the road. He unleashed a torrent of profound, blistering profanity. He demanded to know how American soldiers, men who were supposedly fighting for freedom and decency, could drive past suffering children like mindless, heartless machines. He screamed that if they lost their humanity, they were no better than the Nazis they were fighting to destroy. Patton did not just offer words. He used the absolute power of his command. He ordered his staff to immediately bring food from the officers' mess. He ordered the medics attached to the armored column to halt their advance and treat the civilians. He stood in the mud, refusing to let the multi-million-dollar war machine move a single inch until the children were fed, clothed, and handed over to a secure rear echelon unit. For the GIs watching from the turrets of their Shermans and the cabs of their trucks, the moment was a profound psychological shock. They had spent months building up their mental armor, convincing themselves that they had to be cold to survive. They thought their commander was the coldest of them all. But seeing the supreme commander of the Third Army crying in the mud over a starving child broke the spell. Patton's actions sent a powerful, unspoken message down the ranks. You are warriors, but you are still human beings. You are allowed to feel this pain. The legend of George S. Patton is often reduced to caricatures. He is remembered for the ivory-handled revolvers, the speeches about blood and guts, and the unforgiving drive that crushed the German army. But the true genius and the true tragedy of General Patton was the heavy mask he was forced to wear. He knew that to win the deadliest war in human history, He had to project an aura of invincibility and absolute ruthlessness. He had to make his men fear him more than they feared the Germans. Yet, underneath that heavy armor was a man who felt the tragedy of war more acutely than almost anyone else in the Allied High Command. The incident on the muddy road was not an isolated breakdown. It was a flash of the real George S. Patton. It was the ancient, chivalric knight bleeding through the modern, mechanized general. When Patton stopped that convoy, he defied his own tactical doctrine. He risked the wrath of his superiors. But in doing so, he saved something far more important than a timetable. He reminded thousands of exhausted, traumatized American boys that despite the mud, the blood, and the horror of the Second World War, they had not lost their souls.